All right, Terry Eagleton's Introduction, What is Literature, Part 2. So, the essay itself, after we get over the fundamental question of what is the purpose of, or how can we deduce the question of what is literature, because there must be something called literature. We go into different ways that Eagleton tries to define what literature is, or tries to tackle the problem historically of outlining what literature itself is. The first method, or the first, I think you'd say, criterion that he uses, or he talks about people having used in the past to distinguish what is literary from what is not, is the type of the writing itself, right? He would say that the definition under this category is that literature is imaginary writing, right? It's writing which comes from the imagination. It's inventing a new reality. It's not writing descriptively about reality, right? And so that's the distinction then in this idea of how literature is defined, is the work is coming from the author's mind. It's being created, invented, being projected out into the world, as opposed to non-literary work, which is merely factual or describing the natural world in the phenomena as we observe it, and calculating or couching that in some way which is not part of the creative, imaginative process of the literary author, right? And so he then, of course, goes on to prove how this is not an adequate representation of what makes something literature or not. If you think about what we consider literature, and here's another problem we'll get into in a second, what we consider literature and what is literature, or what are works of literature, are two different things, right? So we talk about things like Milton and Marvell, right? And Francis Bacon's essays are considered literature, and so is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and Clarendon's The History of Rebellion, right? But things like Marx's Communist Manifesto, things like Lamb or John Stuart Mill aren't considered literature, which he takes offense at and umbrage at, because first of all, he's a Marxist, and second of all, because those things seem as important and imaginative as does the work of Marvell or John Milton to Eagleton, right? And then he talks about how in like Icelandic sagas and myths, right, it's hard to tell whether or not they're historical, factual representation, or if they're creative or imaginative. I think that's a ridiculous statement, because of course Thor and Loki and Brunelda are not a truth in the sense of recording historical record. They're cultural myths, and whether or not the culture regards those myths as true is irrelevant to their being factual representations or being fictive, imaginary representations, right? All this to say that the distinction of something being imaginative versus descriptive and factual is a very poor way to decide what is literary and what is not literary. Eagleton kind of strawmans the argument by saying, well, can we look at it this way? And then gives a bunch of reasons why you can't. It seems pretty obvious to me that whether something is imagined or whether something is observed has very little to do with something being literary or not. I can imagine crap that's not literary at all. I can imagine a new car or a new boat or a jet ski, right? I can imagine what life would be like on Mars. I can imagine a million things that have nothing to do with literary merit or the purpose or function of literature, right? So the next category that Eagleton tries to break down the definition of literary and non-literary into is the type of language it employs, right? If language in literature is defamiliarized from ordinary normal language, right? The language you hear on the street corner, the language of the evening newscast, is a non-literary common language. However, the literary language puts pressure on, contorts, twists, commits violence on the normal ways we hear words and use language in a sentence, syntactically, archaic words, different rhythms and different modes of speaking, right, are used by literature to add tension and add pressure to the grammatical syntactic units, so that the words somehow seem to mean more or have more impact than they do in normal speech. The order is changed, the stress is changed, the emphasis is changed, the length of sentence varies, right? And he's saying that this is maybe a criterion to distinguish the literary from the non-literary. But then he gives another couple of reasons why that's not actually the case, because if you look at the just writing about anything, prose writing that's not literary from the 1600s sounds kind of poetic-y and flowery to us today, because our societal standards change. They sound like old archaic words. The Bible, the King James Version even, right, sounds like defamiliarized, unusual wording because the freaking times have changed and the language of the common person has changed, right? And so he says, well, that can't be a good criterion to distinguish what is literature from not literature, right? The next criterion he brings up is part of what he takes from the Russian formalists in the early 1900s. They're a school of criticism that rose up to look at not the content of a story or a poem or a novel, but look at the devices and the forms that are used in it. So trying to take a literary book or any work really and open it up and inspect it like you would a machine. Don't worry about like what it does, whether it's a milk making machine or a car making machine or a machine that pumps water out of the sewers. Doesn't matter. We're looking at what each gear and each pulley does and how they're aligned together and how they make the machine function regardless of its purpose or its content. Right, and so it's kind of like a very scientifically objective way of looking at a work of literature or a work of piece of writing at all without worrying about the emotional impact, the content, the message being conveyed. It's merely looking at the structure of the devices. How many times are metaphors used? How many times is metonymy used? How many times do symbols appear? Are the symbols recurrent? Are they original each time? What are how is it used mimesis? How is it used synecdoche? Different literary devices, rhymes. How many rhymes are there? They in-stopped. How many times they're A rhyme, B rhymes? What are the quatrain patterns? Like things like that. The formal characteristics of writing, hence the name formalists for the school of thought that investigated them, right? And he says again, well, they suck. It's not very good because it turns out that like the content of stuff matters, which no duh. That's what makes something literary partly is its content, right? Don Quixote is different than the phone book, right? And that's just the way that all communication works. It is different based upon the form and the content working together, right? And beyond that, right, to devolve something down to like cogs and freaking springs, right, when it is something that's being created either representing imaginative human capabilities or the human perception of material phenomena of the natural world around us or whatever, right? There's still going to be uniquely idiosyncratic human elements in that communication of that experience, right? And so you have something that can't be reduced to merely the structure itself. There's something animate within that, which is the human contribution to these kind of things. And so the formalists don't really quite work out so well to define what literature is. And then he critiques them further by saying that, well, really what they mean is they're really talking about poetry and not prose anyway. And like poetry is not the only